Good evening, everyone. So welcome to this final plenary for the day on the pedagogies of regional and urban studies. So I'm Stefania Fiorentino. I'm an associate professor at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Land Economy. And I work at the intersection between urban planning and economic geography. So effectively, I research local economic development policy and regeneration strategies. I'm joined today in this panel by Daniel Whittall, Michiel van Meeteren, and Kerstin Schaefer. So I'll just say a few words about our panelists, and then I will hand over to them. And we will have plenty of time at the end for questions and a proper discussion. So Daniel Whittall is the research engagement lead for the Geographical Association, as well as a teacher of geography at a sixth form college in West Yorkshire. He has a PhD in geography, and his research interests and publications have focused on pedagogy, curriculum, and knowledge making in the context of school geography education. So he will cover today the relationship between the school to university transition and his experiences in teaching geography to A-level kids. He will be followed by Michiel van Meeteren, who is an assistant professor in human geography at Utrecht University. His main research interest is studying the past, present, and future of geographic thought and curricula. Geography is an interdisciplinary discipline bringing the social science, the natural sciences, and the humanities by drawing focus on interactions of phenomena in space, and this is what Michiel will reflect on today with us. And last but not least, Kerstin Schaefer is an assistant professor in economic geography at Utrecht University and a research project leader at the Institute of Economic and Cultural Geography at Leibniz University in Hanover. Her active engagement in the economic geography scholar community includes servicing the RSA early career services as RSA early career representative and supporting the Young Economic Geographers Network. So she will reflect on the challenges that our PhD students and early career researchers have when they are approaching the teaching profession. So I won't dwell too much on this any longer, and I invite Dan to the floor.
Thanks very much, Stefania, for the introductions, and everybody for being here at the final panel. Thanks particularly to Alan for the invitation to come and speak at this. I'm really excited to be here. It's really great for us as an organisation, the Geographical Association, to be represented at the Regional Studies Association conference and to have the opportunity to have this dialogue, which I think is a really, really important one, at a really important moment around the pedagogies to do with regional studies, urban studies, and the overlap and intersection between the different disciplines that feed into those different traditions. I'm really excited to hear what the other panelists have to say today as well. I want to start really by talking as part of my presentation, the long history of the relationship between school geography and regional studies at universities. So on the board behind me now, you can see an extract from the Geographical Association's early journal, the Geography Teacher, from 1901. Shows an article by A.J. Herbertson writing about regional geography as a professor of regional geography at the University of Oxford, and also a leading light in the Geographical Association at the time. Herbertson is famous for a particularly environmentally deterministic approach to the study of regions, but I think what his framing here and the significance of his relationship with the Geographical Association sort of shows for us is that regional studies and school geography teaching, at least in the English context, have had a really long history, a historic engagement with one another, and an important dialogue, a dialogue where we might not necessarily still agree with all the conclusions and all the arguments that have been made across that discussion, but a dialogue that's fostered collaboration and cooperation between university academics and researchers and the school geography teaching community. one of the things I'll argue today is that this relationship remains really important, even though the content and the discussion and the concepts with which we work might have changed quite significantly. And I think we can see that, at least in the English context, in a recent report by Ofsted, which is the government body responsible for overseeing the school curriculum. They reviewed school geography teaching in 2023, and they made a particular set of comments about regional studies. Many geography academics and geography education academics have argued that regional studies is one of the most important aspects of school geography teaching, at least in the 20th century. But Ofsted, in the English context, have raised some concerns. There's a couple of quotes on the board behind me. They noted that in England, few schools taught place through regional studies, and that many schools missed any kind of regional study whatsoever. Now, we might interrogate the Ofsted report for its simplistic understanding of the region and of regional concepts, but it shows that there are at least some concerns here about the way that the region and concepts around the region are taught in school geography. And I think this sets us an agenda. It sets us a challenge as a community of school geography educationalists and academics working at the intersection of regional and urban studies. A challenge that I think we should embrace and that we should work to overcome. I think we can work to overcome it by drawing on work in education scholarship recently. The paper behind me by Matt Finn and colleagues argues that there are limits to sustained collaboration across the school-university educational border. We know what those are. They're funding, they're timing, they are to do with reform and changes in both universities and schools in terms of the work patterns of academics, the accountability measures and metrics in schools. But nevertheless, they argue that teachers and their university counterparts ought to share their pedagogical expertise and practices. They call for a dialogue and for the building and rebuilding almost of creative spaces for exchange between communities of practice. And I see this session really as part of building that, or rebuilding that at least, asking questions about what that community of practice ought to look like. For us as a geographical association and an organization, we've done a lot of work to think about teachers, teaching, curriculum and pedagogy, centered on the idea of curriculum making, trying to foreground the active agency of teachers in the development of curriculum and pedagogical materials, and exploring the three forces, as Lambert and Morgan put it back in 2010, that feed into the educational experience. Those three forces being the subject, the teacher choices, the pedagogical activities, but also the student experiences of education. I think this model, it's a few years old now. It might be time for an updating of it, but it still holds true in terms of a set of principles for thinking through curriculum making and educational encounter, especially at a time when educators at university and school level have arguably been deprofessionalized and at a time when technical approaches to teaching and learning tend to prevail or tend to dominate, at least in policy spaces. And we might want to discuss or interrogate what it means to make the curriculum for regional studies across the school-university interface. So very quickly, how long have I got, Stefania? Another couple of minutes? Yeah, okay, great. I'm going to really quickly talk about three projects we've been working on at the Geographical Association that I think showcase some examples of how we might think about regional studies across the school-university interface. The first we've been calling Planning for Real. Planning for Real, I'm sure many of you will know, is a particular approach to urban and regional planning centered on the work of Margaret Wilkinson and colleagues. But the Geographical Association, in collaboration with the University of Sheffield School of Urban Planning and Geography there, have been working to try and apply Planning for Real as a collaborative, democratic and participatory approach to pedagogy and to teaching for urban planning. The project has involved university master's students working with schools in the local area in Sheffield and in West Yorkshire to run urban planning workshops where the students in the schools are effectively local stakeholders. They run urban planning workshops where the young people voice their opinions about what they think about their local area, the local context around which the school is based. And the university students use this as an opportunity to have dialogue with community stakeholders and to build a three-dimensional urban model of the school area and the neighborhood around it, and to work with the young people to develop knowledge and experience and understanding about what that area might look like if it were to be replanned around the needs and interests of young people and their families. We found it to be a really interesting and engaging pedagogical model because of the dialogic nature through which the teaching and learning has happened, and because of the way in which both the students at school and the students at the university level have been able to learn from one another. I think there's some interesting questions there about the kinds of pedagogies we're going to argue for, and the way in which partnerships between schools and universities, especially focused around that A-level transition point or the pre-university transition point, can have some really interesting things to say to us about how we teach regional studies at both school and university level. Next, I want to very briefly introduce a project that will be going live just next week. It's called the Global Inequalities and the Climate Crisis Project. This is a set of educational resources that have been developed in partnership between the Geographical Association and the Decolonizing Education for Peace in Africa project, based at the Open University, working to try and rethink how we might teach about Africa and specifically the Lake Chad region in UK schools by centering the voices of people from the region itself. Working with Cameroonian academics and Cameroonian school teachers, the project has developed curriculum resources and lesson resources that try to foreground Cameroonian voices in conversations that are going to take place in English school classrooms. And I think there's a question here about voice and pedagogy, whose voices get heard in the classroom, and how we think about diversifying those voices and promoting anti-racist approaches to regional studies in classrooms across the school-university border. And one final project, really, really quickly for 30 seconds, centered on Manchester, something we've just started working on. The project's called Walking the Financialized City, working with academics at the University of Sheffield, a city-focused project to develop pedagogical resources for schools and universities, but also for public engagement outside of the classroom, that involves walking the city and interrogating the global financial and economic flows through which urban change and urban transformation is happening. So I think there's a question there about where regional studies pedagogies take place and whether we can move beyond the classroom and look at the city as a site for teaching and learning. I think that's me really in terms of my general introduction, just some points, some questions, a couple of examples of projects, and hopefully some things that we can have more dialogue about in terms of the way that we approach pedagogies in regional and urban studies.
Okay, here am I. I think I'm going to go back to basics, and then from those basics, going to build a whole edifice back up. So bear with me a little bit there. My talk is about the claim that regions make knowledge powerful, and therefore I want to talk about pedagogies of regions and regional geography in general. It's a conversation. It's the record. It's the sediment of a conversation between myself and Tine Beneker, who's a professor of geographical education. And this is basically the kind of dialogue we've been having about the importance of pedagogies and the region. We're part of a research group called Geography and Education, which sounds very pedagogical, but we used to be called regional geography, and before that, general geography, and before that, geography and education. So there's a long history of regional geography and educational geography, you know, switching between one another. So we're not that far apart as we think. So what I'm going to start with, as a good pedagogue does, is defining some of my key terms so we're all on the same page. So the first thing is, what is pedagogy? What are we talking about here? And just take a textbook definition. You know, pedagogy is the method and practice of teaching. So it could be a mass noun as a discipline. You're specialists in pedagogy. But there's also a specific pedagogy focused as a subject, like a pedagogy for GIS or a pedagogy for how to teach the region. So then it becomes the why and what of how to teach whom. So how are we teaching the region? And how could we teach the region? And what's the best way to teach the region? That's what we're going to talk about. The second definition, and it's strange to do that at the Regional Studies Association, you know, what is a region? But it's actually quite interesting to revisit that term. A region is a socially constructed spatial entity, commonly denoting, you know, a scale in between. It's between a city and a country, or between a country and the world. And socially constructed is important. It means it's made up by people. We collectively construct a region, and it could be collectively constructed by policymakers, and it's a thin region, or it could have much more meaning for the people living in that region. It gets a thick identity, and then it almost becomes synonymous with a place. And indeed, somebody like Ron Johnston in his book, A Question of Place, literally said, you know, where I say place, we could have said region instead, and then he had all sorts of arguments why to do so. And with Johnston, I get to my second point, which is a book that was published by my research group when it was still called Regional Geography. And Ron Johnston wrote a chapter in that. And in that, he wanted to be provocative. And he made a statement. This was at the heyday of the new regional geography. and after discussing, and it's still worthwhile read the chapter, but I'm going to argue a bit against it. He says, well, we don't need a regional geography, but we do need regions in geography. By the way, a regional geography is that you organize the curriculum around regions, and with regions in geography, you might have a thematic organization where the region plays a role. So this is a fundamental pedagogical choice. I'm going to argue from a pedagogical perspective that we might need both, but I'm also going to explain to you what's the advantage of both. So why do you still need some regional geography in geographical education? And when you talk about a regional geography, you talk about the organization of the curriculum, and it means it's organized around places. From a pedagogical perspective, we like to think of that approach as thinking of the curriculum in terms of a vocabulary. It's about the substance. And it's not about the grammar, it's how you stitch the substance together. And here you can already think, you need both. Because if you only have a vocabulary, it becomes a garble of words. And if you only have a grammar, you don't know what you're talking about. So any pedagogy is a compromise, and this is the Dutch compromise. We sort of see the regions and the themes stitched together. But then the question is, which one lies on top? And if your pedagogy is totally a regional geography, you risk that your geography becomes a catalogue of trivia, or what in the UK used to be called Capes and Bay geography. You just learn the places and their characteristics. But there's a danger on the other side as well. If your curriculum is organized around themes, it means the region only gets represented as a stereotype. And you can find it in geography textbooks. Bangladesh becomes a place with poor people and floods. Chile is only mentioned in the textbook because of its volcanoes. London is a place that's got a lot of banks. And we forget actually the richness that a regional geography, where you see how the things hang together, can offer. And it means, as geographers, we start to contribute to stereotyping places to just one dominant element that is important from our thematic perspective. And in addition, a more regional geography approach gives an identity to the subject. The more thematic you come, the less people start recognizing geography as what they think it is, which is a study about maps, about places, about representations, about traveling the world. So that might be a reason why we still need some regional geography. So let me now talk a little bit about why we do need regions in geography. And I need to go to my fourth page here. And that has to do with why regions make geographical knowledge powerful. And the idea of powerful knowledge is that actually you can use knowledge to learn new things, to broaden your horizons, to think critically. And you can say that there are three ways of geographical thinking, three styles of geographical thinking, and all three of them, the region can play a pivotal role. So in this one, this is the idea of geographical thinking through abstraction. You extract one element, and then you use that to compare two different places. And the reason why the region keeps knowledge powerful is because even if you talk about something in the abstract, gentrification, financialization, climate change, the fact that there is a region in there means that from a pedagogical perspective, you're still pinning it down to concrete places. And that means that this knowledge becomes accessible. It means a student is able to compare places in terms of this higher theoretical phenomenon. And those are the things that you lose out of sight if you don't have this anchoring in the concrete spatial reality. And therefore, this mid-level generalization in terms of abstractions make knowledge powerful. So let me now talk about the second way of geographical reasoning, which would be the vertical comparison. We tend to think of geographical thinking in understanding how the global affects the local. You have big processes like polarization, uneven development, and they land in particular local places. And this kind of thematic region sort of expresses those vertical relations through scalar relationships. It's also the region where you can sort of pin down the percolation of these global processes and make them real for people and make them see how things happening on different scalar levels, let's say the interaction of globalization and climate change, is actually coming together to create this unique local combination of visible, observable phenomena. And again, that is what makes knowledge powerful, because it allows a student to relate these big questions, but big abstract questions, on the concrete level of observing. So it allows you to grab things that are happening on different scalar levels, either below the region or above the region, to come together. So that's the horizontal comparison. Of course, well, the vertical comparison is in the same slide as the horizontal comparison. There's another thing why vertical comparison used to be very important in terms of region, is that we believed that if we start with the most familiar place, the local, and then branch out to the global, there would be a certain pedagogical value to that. But as people have critiqued, and many textbooks can be critiqued at the fact that not everybody in your classroom or not everybody in your audience will have the same local. The local place, the local sense of place, and the global sense of place of people that come together in one place can actually be a whole set of experience of being connected to all sorts of places around the world through migration experience, through intergenerational sorts of dynamic. And that's why the horizontal comparison is, as a third wave geographical reasoning, has gained more importance. And this is indeed Doreen Massey's global sense of place, where you use the region to pin down on one place and then see how this one place, this one region, is connected to all these other points in the world. And you can sort of show that nothing is ever self-contained as a local or regional phenomenon, but that there is a regional distinctiveness in how one notes adds up to all these other places in the world. And of course, there's a great pedagogical experience in that, in understanding how we are all connected to other people. So just to wrap up over here, having had these three different modes of reasoning in terms of why we need regions in geography, and also made the case that we need a regional geography to complement all those other geographies in regional studies, I would say that the most important takeaway for this audience is that regions can be the active ingredient, as Trevor Barnes and Brett Christophers called it, that makes knowledge powerful. And therefore, it has a role to play in geographical pedagogies. And in respectful disagreement with Ron Johnston, as I've argued over here, this requires both the continued production of regional geographies as we need a place for regions in our geographical curriculum. And that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Hey everybody. First I wanted to thank Stefania for inviting me to this very interesting panel. I'm lucky today to have a bit of two hats on for what I'm going to talk about. And this is not this, this is this. Exactly, because I will be talking now coming from a very abstract level that Michiel introduced us to a very practical level. And I will be talking a little bit about like training PhD students, our role as supervisors, but also our roles as, for me, former, but for some in the audience, current PhD students. Because I'm wearing the hat as early career representative, but also the hat of somebody who has started supervising PhD students, has been at it for 4 years. The first one's going to submit hopefully next month, which is very exciting. So I wanted to share some observations, some challenges that I have experienced in supervising PhDs in the field of regional studies. And the main questions that I want to get at is like, what are the main challenges that we are encountering in PhD education and how can we address them? And of course, these are just like, I made 4 points. I just picked some that have been in my mind. Of course, there are many, many more points we should be talking about, but I just wanted to give some impulses so we can have a conversation about it. And I also wanted to make this a bit more broad because regional studies is known for its diversity with many, many disciplines that feel they belong here, which makes us such a great and strong community. It also means that we have very different ways of training our PhD students, right? So we have from structured PhD programs where PhD students take classes, get input, to programs. For example, in Germany, I remember people that get on a full teaching position and they are expected to do their PhD on the side without much structured input to it, right? So we have a very diverse set of like how PhD training can look, and I'm trying to be a bit more general here to be inclusive of that. So a first point that I wanted to make or a first challenge that I observe is a set of implicit academic skills that we require from the PhD students. So when they finish, for example, their masters and they become PhD students, there is this whole new world that they're introduced at conferences, for example, also when they want to publish papers. But this new world has a lot of implicit rules, right? And you can learn them mostly by observing. So something that I thought was really helpful is going to conferences with PhD students even early in their career so they can observe what are the unwritten rules and also get more comfortable with like the community, which I think is very, very important, so they can also pick role models, right? They implicitly learn what are the expectations in terms of quality, how do I do a good presentation, and also talk about this, right? So I found that in the beginning it can be hard for them to interpret different situations, so having a conversation about this can be very beneficial to them, but also to us, because they bring a fresh set of eyes to what we do here, right? So seeing from their perspective also points out odd situations in their eyes that might be helpful for us to evaluate, and also the way we talk to each other, constructive criticism, or maybe sometimes not so constructive criticism that I guess everybody has experienced from reviewers or from people at conferences. And I want to make a point here that I think the regional studies community is already doing really, really good. Of course, we can always do better, but I think we are a very welcoming, very supportive community. But I think in order to ensure that it stays that way, we need to teach the next generation, because our PhD students today are our colleagues of tomorrow, right? So it's very important that we also teach them how to give constructive criticism and how to also process the criticism that they get themselves. And this all features into trying to promote a healthy work culture, which we also want going forward, I guess. Okay. The next point I wanted to make is about acquiring methods, because methods are mostly a core focus of doing a PhD, because compared to what they learn in school and what they learn during university education, the type of methods is different. It's way more state-of-the-art. It's way more learning things that go even beyond what your supervisor often knows, right? So this is very crucial, and I think a lot of PhD students really focus on getting the method right and trying really to do a good job with that. But what I observe sometimes is that then, for example, research design and asking interesting questions can get a little bit lost in the process, because they are often so focused on mastering the methods, which, don't get me wrong, is completely crucial and important. But I also think we need to emphasize that asking important questions and not stopping after the analysis, but the interpretation, like what does this really mean for the real world, is what connects us to practitioners and policymakers, right? And then our research becomes interesting. So we really need to emphasize that the methods are a tool. You need to do it great, but they are not the goal in themselves. You want to do the next step, and you want to ask meaningful questions, and I think that's very important here. My third point is about the diversity of challenges among PhD students, which I was lucky to experience by supervising PhD students from different cultural backgrounds, different disciplines even, which can be a challenge, but also very rewarding, different learning abilities, for example. And I think here it's, again, not only us as supervisors, like having the, let's say, duty to get to know the PhD students and to figure out what the different challenges is that they experience, but also to learn from them about challenges that we might not ourselves have experienced when we're doing a PhD, and also seeing from their perspective. And I think this can be very rewarding in evaluating how we teach PhD students. For example, if we're thinking about writing, right? Writing is such an integral part of our job, and for some people it's way easier than for other people. And depending on like the challenges the students face, it's important to offer a wide range of tools that can help them to, for example, become better writers, or become better at statistics, or become better at analyzing data, right? So I think this is an important point to notice, that there is not one size fits all in PhD training, and for supervisors it requires us to constantly adapt. And the last point I wanted to make is, how do we empower independent PhD students? Because the PhD is a journey to becoming independent, and I've certainly struggled with that, because what is the right amount of supervision? Of course, there is more supervision needed in the beginning, because we need to set quality expectations and ethical standards for research. But how do we manage this transition of leaving them more space to develop themselves, and also communicate our expectations that we want them to become more independent, right? And I think oftentimes in academia, a lot of spaces are quite hierarchically organized, just because like the ones of us who have more experience become then the organizers, or they organize a special issue, or they organize a conference. And something that I really liked was, there is this initiative, the Young Economic Geographers Network, that was set up by PhD students only for PhD students. So it's a conference where only PhD students are allowed, and it's only organized by PhD students. And like attending these conferences myself when I was a PhD student really showed me how much confidence that can give you if you feel like, you know, nobody who's cleverer or more senior than you is watching you, but actually you can practice giving constructive feedback, because you finally dare to raise your hand and say something, right? Because you're all on the same level. And then also asking if you didn't understand the feedback, because I think a lot of people, oftentimes in these conference situations, particularly younger people, maybe didn't fully understand the feedback they got, but like they don't want to look stupid or anything, so they don't want to ask about it. And I think these spaces really allow PhD students to dare to ask, dare to have conversations, and dare to create an environment that they want to do research in. And yeah, I think this can be very helpful in empowering them. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you to all three of you, and thanks for giving us all these diverse perspectives, but I think they sort of come together by reflecting on how we should also promote inclusion in different ways through our pedagogies. So before I open up to the floor for questions, I have a question for yourself. How do you think that AI, so artificial intelligence, is actually going to change our profession, or more specifically, our teaching tasks and our pedagogies? Do you see that as a threat or as an opportunity, or maybe both? And actually, you know, what are the opportunities that we can gather from the use of AI that our students are already making, I guess? Any views there? Who wants to start? Maybe Dan, you start.
Shall I start, just by virtue of being closest to this end of the table here? I mean, it's the big question, isn't it? And it's a great unknown, but I think one way of approaching it is to go back to the curriculum-making model that I was talking about earlier on. If we think of teachers as active agents involved in the pedagogical and curriculum development process, AI becomes an additional tool, an additional resource. There will be good iterations of it and less good iterations of it, just as there are with every other educational resource. Clearly, there are potential challenges in that AI, perhaps arguably differently to things like the textbook, doesn't just reshape the way in which teaching and learning gets done, but it reshapes the work of the educator, arguably in a way that could push forward some of those deprofessionalizing tendencies that I mentioned in terms of reducing the intellectual work that teachers do. I think that's clearly one of the big threats The response to that is to center teacher agency at all levels, whether that's in schools or universities, and to perhaps refocus on what it means to make the curriculum and to actively organize educators to have conversations across all phases of education around curriculum making for regional studies in transdisciplinary ways.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting, although I do think that it's potentially not diminishing our role as educator, but if anything, reinforcing the kind of basic skills we should teach our students, whether this is PhD students that are approaching, the next, as you say, Kerstin, they will be our next colleagues or students. So maybe it will be less about concepts and more about learning methodological skills, learning how to relate to each other, how to ask questions, how to see the world. And so maybe having active classes, active learning activities, so site visits or reflecting on a real world task, whether this is writing a report, this is based on my own experience, or interacting with the policymakers, so understanding what their job is going to be afterwards. These are all things they cannot learn from ChatGPT or any other platform. Then I don't know, you, Kerstin, is that your perspective with your PhD students as well? Or?
So, I mean, I completely agree to that it will change curricula. When I'm thinking about the perspective of the PhD students, I've been working with PhD students that were challenged by a variety of dyslexia issues. Mm-hmm. And for them, ChatGPT was a total game changer. And it actually made me see the real value, because they were having great ideas, they were really good at the methods, but they were really struggling to make a coherent text out of it. And if this is the step that ChatGPT can help you with, because it's not taking away anything of you're thinking about the problem and you're having good ideas and things like that, but it's really just helping to make a structured text that other people can then read and understand. I was just really amazed at this, how helpful this was and how it gives people a chance to be our colleagues in the future that maybe would have really, really struggled otherwise to put out any paper.
Is it going to help also creating less stereotypes for geography, or potentially more? Michiel, what do you think? Sorry to put you on the spot.
It will definitely create more stereo. I think if I go back to the grammar and the vocabulary, and first think about the threats and then about the opportunities. So the threat for the grammar part is the de-skilling of students. And that threat is particularly in writing skills. And we now already see that high schools are avoiding essay writing because they can't evaluate, which means that students that come in at universities are even less able to. It's already a problem, and it's only going to become bigger. And of course, if geography is about writing worlds, if it's about evocation of other worlds, we've got a de-skilling challenge there. On the vocabulary side, it is indeed the hallucinations, is the fact that there's a stronger need to think about, geographical knowledge that is true. And particularly if you start talking about places in the world and you ask ChatGPT to write a narrative. Well, I know a concrete example on the geography and the politics of a place like the Democratic Republic Congo. You're going to get a completely garbled answer, and it's going to present it really self-confidently, like this is the truth. And they get the capital city and the provincial capitals wrong, they get the rivers wrong, the winner of the war becomes the loser of the war. It are these kind of hallucinations that AI produces. So you get faulty geographical knowledge, and I think there's a huge challenge there. And I think the inversion is there. Our challenge as educators is that we have to gatekeep good geographical knowledge. You have to think about, these are bodies of work that are sort of certified by us as academics. This is good research, and therefore what that research says is verified. And we've got to teach students how to make those distinctions between AI-generated and non-AI-generated knowledge. And once we do that, we can harness the power of it. Think of AI as a very sophisticated search engine. What if it allows me to read 20,000 pages of good geographical material, sort of pull up examples for teachers? It could be a great resource, but there's a lot of infrastructure work to be done,
Yeah.
and I'm not confident that the edtech companies will provide us that research.
And probably this is up to us, isn't it? Right. So I'm conscious that it's only 10 minutes before the drinks reception, so maybe this is about time to open up to questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Yes, Marcin?
Thank you very much. Thanks for stimulating presentations. I have a question, that got triggered by what Dan showed about engaged learning and getting students to engage with the real world. And I was just wondering if you could think of any caveats therein, or things we have to be careful with when asking our students to do this. And what triggers me to ask this is like questions of creating expectations, maybe, among the community you engage with about how this will actually trigger change, and maybe it won't because it will end up in student reports. So there's like ethical questions therein. I wonder if you could elaborate on, if you had some ideas about that. Thank you.
Okay. Dan?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. This is the educational challenge, isn't it, really? It's how do you balance these different angles and these different perspectives? I mean, engaged learning is I think, really productive. It's really, it has great potential, but obviously learning that's based around the sorts of dialogic models that I was talking around, or learning that involves going out into the city to study the urban geography has a number of different challenges. First is teacher expertise, the expertise of those engaged in that process. We know that teachers at higher education and school level are pressed for time. It can be challenging to do the work, to be able to engage in a dialogue out of the classroom. There's a lot of work that's required to go into that in terms of the planning of those kind of engaged learning opportunities. It's very different to planning a more structured lesson, isn't it, in those sorts of ways. So the professionalization, but also the supportive networks, I think, in dialogues that can help with that are really, really crucial. And I think ethics is something that's kind of hovering above everything that all three of us have said in a way, isn't it, really? But we haven't really had the time to dive into and to discuss. We think of ethics much more as a research-focused thing, don't we, as a community? Perhaps we need a lot more reflection on pedagogical ethics and what it means to focus on things like an ethics of care. The last slide I didn't quite get to was a little quote from the QAA benchmark statement for higher education in geography, and it really centers the idea that it has a list of things that geography graduates might expect from their teaching and learning, and one of them is an ethics of care from all involved, and I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about the way that we do teaching and not just research. How do we care for everybody that's involved in the learning process?
Michiel, you wanted to add something.
I mean, you've already covered a great deal of things. I think the risk of these things are over-research. We've got certain disadvantaged communities in the Netherlands that get 7 requests a month for some kind of student participation. So it all comes down to time. It comes down to the ethics of how do you feed your research results back into a community and make a community take an advantage of it. And for every neighborhood that is studied 100 times in a year, there's 100 kilometers down the road that has never been studied, and where even the politicians will still show up for an interview with students. So it's all about how you give back, what you do research, and there's great pedagogical possibilities in actually teaching students how to engage with the world ethically. But it requires work. It cannot be routine.
Thank you. Let's take another question. Yes, here at the front.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my understanding of the cultural differences that have developed have always been because of the other species that we've cultivated in order to feed ourselves. That we deliberately recreate their populations, cultivate their populations, so that our populations can sustain themselves. So the varieties, the variations arise from the variety of other species that inhabit that particular locality. And it seems to me that and for me that's always been the basis of the Kant's groundwork of all morals. That if we can't look after the species that look after us, I nearly said we're stuffed, and I'm afraid that that doesn't seem to be around much in the discourse so far. Anyway, I would say the role of other species and the natural responsibility we have as a duty to ourselves to make sure that the ecosystem that we all live on is not being polluted. And I do worry that that's not somehow more in focus. Thank you.
Just to be clear, when you talk about species, you are referring to protecting the natural environment and environmental resources, or different groups of the population and of our regional population? Okay.
Development and sustainable agriculture.
Okay.
Mine is completely opposite of. That was all. And the whole.
Yeah.
I beg your pardon. I'm not sure I made that question very clear.
Okay. Well, yes, Dan, please.
Just a really quick response. I think there's a lot more to be said about the significance of ecological approaches within regional studies pedagogies that perhaps we haven't talked about today. One thing that might be of note is that the UK government, for example, has just rolled out a new curriculum review. There's a call out for people to input into that process and to have dialogue with the government about it if you think there are important things that ought to be taught in the school curriculum. But one of the things they did when they rolled out that review was that they paused the launch of the new environmental science, GCSE. And so that was ready to go pretty much and is now on hold and has effectively been stopped and won't start for another few years. So there are real pressing questions about ecology, regional studies and education, I think.
Anyone wants to add more points? Otherwise, what I can just add is that also from a policy perspective, especially in the UK, within planning, there is debate around land uses we should consider as part of the planning process, and agriculture was so far always separated, but it's under. So in the last sort of planning system review, one of the key points that we are set to consider is how do we include back agriculture and agriculture uses over land as part of the wider planning process. So that's certainly going into the direction you were pointing to. Are there any sort of final question, I guess, because we are 2-3 minutes from our break? Yes, at the back. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Azfar. I'm from Ulster University. I just want to comment on one thing, that why we always see AI as a challenge, not as a assistive use of AI. Talking about on the pedagogical, it can assist, but how we as a teacher or researcher can use those AI techniques or technologies to evaluate the work of the students.
Well, I think Kerstin gave us a good example earlier. I don't know if there are more examples we can.
I think when we're thinking, like, how I understood the question was, can we use AI as teachers to evaluate student answers, right?
Who are using AI?
So the students use AI to write things, and we use AI to correct the things. Yeah, I mean, I think that is under the table probably already happening in some instances. I think, in general, it changes the skill set that we need, right? So when I was thinking about what does it mean if my PhD students, for example, if they use AI to kind of like construct texts, I think it makes us even need to pay more attention to the text being very rigorous. And I think if we want to use AI to generate texts, for example, I think what we want to get at the end is not only a productivity gain, but we want to have a quality gain. And I think then what I observe if I have students or PhD students have assistance by AI to write texts, that you really need to go over these texts so much in detail to, for example, to find factual flaws, but also like the flow of the text, the logic of the arguments. Like many AI technologies are not super great at doing that. And I think this is a skill that needs a lot of learning to make a really nice flowing, really coherent argument in the text. It's difficult to achieve, it's very high level, and I think what it shows me is that if we want to include these technologies, we actually need to like focus the training of the students and the PhD students even more on like making really beautifully crafted text, because now they have the tools that might enable them to have the time to make the texts really beautifully crafted, but you have to get to that level, and it's going to be really difficult because you need to start from writing the text yourself, from building the arguments yourself, and reading a lot of texts in order to understand how you make them flow beautifully. So I think actually introducing AI requires even more skills in writing text, but different skills, if that makes sense.
Miguel, you want to add something?
Yeah, and to summarize, the problem of the economics of AI are presented to us as time savers. And usually the budget is cut because we are able to save time. Using AI responsibly will make the teacher's work exponentially time consuming. Therefore, if you really want us to use AI, that's good, but then we need to have much more prep time, much more time to correct essays, and as long as that's not the economic argument, because it's a budget cut argument, because that's what's being presented to our university administrators, we sort of have to push back.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, and I would add also that if what we are teaching the students is to learn critical thinking and producing evidence-based arguments, that's not what AI does. So yeah, maybe one of the way of using it at the moment would be compare the text that is produced by AI and tell us what the flaws are and where the critical nuances are missing. Right, I think this might be a good way of ending this panel by remembering ourselves that we have a role and we are useful as educators despite the role of AI. And thank you very much to the three panelists of today, Dan, Kerstin, and Michiel. Shall we thank them in the traditional way? There are drinks outside. Is that correct, Alex? Yes.